All right, good morning, troopers. So, who of you did the 10K run this morning? Not bad, and all the others still showering. So, for the first talk on this day, we have a well-known face on stage. The last 2 years, Niels talked about hacking the Apple Watch, and today they will talk about hacking smartwatches for children. So please give a warm round of applause. Stage is yours.
Thank you, thank you. I am super excited to be back here, and thank you all so much for joining me this early in the morning and after your morning workout already. What I have for you today is a story about a smartwatch, a children's smartwatch, and specifically a children's smartwatch from a company called Xplora. And Xplora markets these smartwatches very explicitly to parents in terms of security and safety, as sort of a mechanism to always know where your child is and to be able to communicate with them. And if we look at what the actual product looks like, that looks something like this. So we have the Parents app on our phone, where we can see where our child currently is, and then we can also send them messages. And those will then arrive on the watch, and our child will be able to reply to them and say, "Nope, I will not be home. Good luck with that," and send a fun emoji or something. That's sort of the product. As for the company behind the product, the person behind all of this is this guy here. That's Sten Kirkbak, is a Norwegian guy who founded Xplora. He's a father himself. Nowadays, he looks a bit more like that when he's selling to investors. But that seems to be going rather well for him and for Xplora. These are going a bit faster than one. OK. It seems to be going rather well for Xplora. They have collaborations with major German soccer clubs very recently, and they are also being offered as sort of bundle deals by telecommunications providers. So you can buy an Xplora watch via Deutsche Telekom, who will then sell you the mobile data contract to go along with the watch, so your child always has internet connectivity. And if we dig around on the internet a bit, we will find investors' reports on Xplora's website, where they add some more very interesting information for us. Because it turns out they estimate that in their home market of Norway, they have now reached a market penetration where about every 5th child between the age of 4 to 10 in Norway is running around with one of these smartwatches with an active subscription. So that already felt like a lot of children to me. And if we take this worldwide, they claim that they have sold over, I think, 1.5 million devices. So that's a lot of watches that are out there. And if we turn the page a bit further in the investors report, we can also start to find some insight into the hardware side of things. So here, for example, we can see that in 2018, they started out selling their first smartwatch models, and they did that in an exclusive supplier relationship with a company called Chiho360. Chiho360 is a Chinese IT security company, which, I mean, on the face of it, sounds good. These are people that know security, right? They mostly make antivirus software. I'm not sure why they started this side hustle of making children's smartwatches. And they have a whole history of issues and controversies themselves. We're not going to go into that too much today, because it turns out that in 2023, they spent a lot of money developing a new product line and a new line of 3 different smartwatch models that are presumably manufactured by some other white label manufacturer, but we can't really tell. If we look ahead a bit, there's certain HTTP requests that include this Psyche string as a vendor ID. I tried Googling for that, but I couldn't really find any company with that name or anyone using that. But presumably, this is another manufacturer that they are sourcing these watches from now. Now, when I first started talking about this watch and the vulnerabilities associated with it, there was one topic that came up in the public response to that, I think. And so I want to talk about that briefly, and that's China. Because the response when we started doing disclosure for this watch and trying to talk about this a bit more publicly often was something along the lines of, yeah, well, if you give your child like this cheap Chinese-made smartwatch, what do you expect? But I want to push on that a little bit, because if you think about it, where does your Apple Watch come from? Right? Your Apple Watch is also made in China. Every smartwatch is made in China. That's not a distinguishing trait. And in fact, all of the firmware that we looked at here seems to originate not from China, but from Norway, presumably, at least the European Union, probably. There are certain components on these watches that might be supplied from a Chinese OEM, but we didn't find any relevant vulnerabilities there. And for example, I am pinning this entire Norway attribution a bit shakily on a single misspelled string, but I'm told that's how you do attribution. So this misspelling of the word incoming kind of neatly matches how you spell the corresponding word in Norwegian. And that appears again and again throughout their code, their kind of custom logic code. So we suppose that the code that we're going to look at today is made in Europe, and that sort of matches with this public narrative that Xplora is trying to spin of privacy made in Europe, right? We have this small, cool startup that's not a US big tech corporation, and it's kind of more independent. It's not Apple, it's not Google. They sit in a nice fancy street in Oslo in Norway, and they take your privacy and your security seriously, right? They care about your data. They wouldn't hurt you. And again, this is something that is very explicit in Xplora's marketing material. For example, we found a fun blog post back from 2020 from the CEO of Xplora himself that kind of was published on the occasion of Apple announcing that you would be able to use Apple Watches for children as well. And of course, that is kind of a threat to Xplora's business model. So they published this blog post where the CEO is very concerned about the kinds of data that we share about our children, and we share this data with a big tech corporation like Apple. And then on the other side, he positions Xplora as this much more trustworthy company that has the strictest security and transparency standards and will ensure that all the data of you and your child, right, your child's location and your communications and photos and whatever, will stay very secure. So those are big words. And so when Xplora started doing a large physical marketing campaign that put posters in the subway stops that I used to go to work every day, well, I figured someone should probably have a look at that, right? We should try to independently verify what's going on here. And so I bought one of these watches, and I handed it off to a student of mine, Malte. And Malte did his master's thesis on doing a security analysis of this watch. And so if you put yourself in Malte's shoes and someone hands you this watch that we don't know anything about, right? At this point, it's just a black box, and we are trying to figure out how we get initial access to this thing and actually perform this security analysis. A very interesting thing that you can do without opening anything up yourself is you can look at public documentation. I know this came up in a previous talk yesterday already, but if you want to sell anything with an antenna in it in the US, and typically you do, that involves getting approval from the FCC. To do that, you need to submit a whole bunch of documents, and a subset of these documents is publicly available. And that includes, for example, these images of the product. You have to have external photos of the product, and interestingly for us, you also have to have internal photos. So we can just, using public information, we can already see what the motherboard of the device looks like, what kind of chips are being used there, if there might be any obvious debug ports, that kind of stuff. Now, in this case, what ended up being most interesting for us was not related to this motherboard, but to the charger. Because this is the charger that we see in the FCC report, right? It has 4 pins kind of like you would expect to see in a USB cable and a USB connection. But the charger that we got in the box looked differently. that only has 2 pins, just power and ground for charging. And so apparently, what we see here in the report is some sort of debug developer internal charger that they do not intend to go out to customers. And so we figured, hey, we have a soldering iron. We can Frankenstein together something. We can add some more pins to that and kind of clamp it to the back of the watch to get a connection. And if you do that and connect it to your computer, the watch actually shows up as a USB device. That's very cool. That's sort of an initial foothold. And that already gives us access to some logging information and stuff like that. And we can definitely verify that this watch is running a version of Android, so it's mostly like an Android smartphone on your wrist. But we don't have any meaningful level of access yet. We can't pull firmware or anything. So at that point, we start thinking, how do we go from here? There's all of these advanced techniques that you might use. We could desolder the flash chip and to kind of dump the firmware from there. We could try starting some hardware glitching attempts, maybe get this into an unlocked bootloader state or dump firmware from there, whatever, lots of possibilities. But in the end, we figured, hey, what's the dumbest thing that could possibly work? And so this being basically an Android phone, I think a lot of you know how to enable developer mode on Android, right? You go to the settings, and you tap the build version number a bunch of times. And that did something on this watch as well, which was very cool. It didn't enable developer mode outright, but we got this new pop-up that we never seen before that asks us to enter a 4-digit PIN. And so now, again, my kind of hacker mind starts going, and I'm like, OK, can we somehow attach a keyboard or mouse emulator to this watch and kind of get a rubber ducky situation going and try to brute force all of these pins? But while I am thinking about this, Malte had gone home, and he'd spent 2 hours of his evening just typing out every single 4-digit pin. And sometimes that works. And now we have this little toggle that we can just flip to get USB debugging on the device. And once we do that, this watch just behaves like any other Android phone. So we can use ADB, and I can mirror the screen of my watch to my computer, and I can also browse the file system. And of course, that's great for us, because now we have a way to get to the vendor-specific software that is running here. So they have a bunch of apps that are running on the watch. There's a custom calculator, a custom camera, a custom chat app, and so on. But most of the interesting logic is in something called the XP Common Service that kind of unifies all of the communication to Explorer servers. And so we can now start just digging through decompiled Java code, as you would with JetX, and kind of untangle this whole system and see how the communication works. And what we get from that eventually is an architecture that looks like this. So we have the parent's phone, and the parent's phone talks to a certain HTTP API endpoint on some Explorer server. And then in a quite typical setup for an IoT gadget, the Explorer watch also has an HTTP endpoint and talks to another server endpoint, but it also has this MQTT communication channel. So MQTT, standard message passing protocol, and the infrastructure here is being provided apparently by AWS, by Amazon, who offer that as their IoT core product. And that allows Explorer to kind of send push notifications, so to say, like send messages to the watch and have the watch send replies back in a very easy way. With that understanding of the system, we can now actually get started and talk about security. So one very interesting request that we identified early on, just because it is the most frequent request that is being made to Explorer servers, is this. It's a request to this init endpoint, and if we squint our eyes enough, there's a lot of high entropy values in there. So there's a lot of opportunities that could provide security and authentication here. And if we dig through the firmware, we can kind of start untangling what's what. And quite quickly, we see that these two blue values here, well, one of them is obviously just a standard Unix timestamp, nothing fancy here. And the other value is a static secret that we see in exactly that form embedded in the firmware. All right, so what remains are these three red values, which we can all trace to different functions in the firmware. And if we take a look at these, or at some of these functions, the first red flags kind of start showing up. Now, you don't have to understand the code in its entirety while it's on the slide, but you see some instances of MD5 being used, right? Usually, that's when things start falling apart. So they're doing something, they're using some crypto primitives here. And if we spend long enough untangling that, we can kind of reduce it to this view on the slide. And, well, it turns out if we plug in all of these values, there's nothing left that provides authentication, really. So all of these inputs in the end are publicly accessible data. We have a timestamp. The current time is not secret. We have the IMEI of the watch, like the serial number, basically. And that is a value that we can very easily enumerate, or sometimes you can also get a value from the back of the packaging that someone lists on eBay or something. So these are rather easily accessible. And then the rest are just static secrets that we can find in the firmware itself. So if we know the IMEI of a watch, there's now nothing stopping us from impersonating this authentication request. And if we do that, what we get is this. This is a short-lived API key and secret that we can use to authenticate further requests to this HTK API endpoint that we've seen on the architecture slide. And the rest of it is certificates and keys and configuration data for this AWS IoT Core MQTT channel. And if we have both of that, well, we can now attack both of these communication channels. We can impersonate the watch over HTTP, and we can also impersonate the watch over MQTT. And to illustrate what we can do with that kind of access, I want to slip into a different role for a second, because we are going to pretend that we are child-eating witches living in the forest. And nowadays, with increasing digital transformation, we are faced with a very severe problem, because back in the day, children just used to wander into the forest, and we could pick them and eat them. But now every child, or every fifth child, has this smartwatch on their wrist that lets their parents know where they are at all times. That presents a problem, and so we decide that the only viable solution is to pursue an education in IT security and kind of see what we can do here. And it turns out with this level of access that we've just seen, we can do quite a number of interesting little magic spells. The first of those is just abusing the messaging feature. So in this video, you can see our Python proof of concept that will read the message history from parent to child. Those are the messages we sent earlier. And then it will also send a bunch of messages to the parents, you know, just to let them know that their child won't be there for a while and not to be too worried. And then the second thing that we might want to do is we might want to do some advertising, right? So we might want to let the children know where to find us. And, well, that also works. That looks like this. So we can make an attacker-controlled string show up in a push notification on the watch, and we can tell them, hey, you know, maybe go into the forest. It's kind of cool there. And this looks conceptually very simple. But it turns out that this is the most sophisticated attack that I'm going to show you today. Because when we started doing disclosure for all of this stuff, we didn't have this capability. Because we can essentially do everything that the watch can do. We have all the credentials that the watch has. But the watch is not designed to send messages to itself. But when you start talking about this and you start, hey, we compromised this, and we compromised this, and we compromised the messaging, it's much easier to say we can send and receive messages rather than explain, well, we can send messages to the parents, but in the other way, we can only read them and we can't write them, and there's all this nuance. So at some point, I started sitting down and being like, OK, we have this level of access. Somehow I have to get a message onto the watch. And it turns out that, as you can see here, that does work. You just have to be a bit tricky about it. So what we ended up doing is using our attack script, we send a message to the Explorer server that is ostensibly just a message from the watch to the parents, just as we've seen before. That has our attacker-controlled string in it. And then the server will assign each message a unique identifier. So we grab that identifier, and over MQTT, we send a message to the watch saying, hey, you have a new message incoming with this ID. This will then cause the watch to go to the server and be like, hey, can you give me the contents of the message with this ID? And the server, of course, returns our attacker-controlled string, and that's enough to make this instant messaging notification pop up on the phone with our string in it, on the watch with our string in it. It's unfortunately not enough to fool the messaging app on the watch itself. So if you actually open the notification, the text won't be there, because that app actually realizes, hey, this is a message from myself. That doesn't make any sense. I'm not going to display it as from the parents. But it's enough to get this primitive to show text on the watch in the notification. And that made our communication of this vulnerability a lot easier. Right, next trick, teleportation. It turns out that we can also hijack the GPS location mechanism of these watches. So using this fancy MQTT GUI client, we can just plug in all of the credentials that we got earlier. And then when the parent requests a new location from the child, we see a message popping up there that contains this XP push ID. And if we plug that into our Python script, we can just send a fake location update. And then you'll see that now our child is no longer standing in Darmstadt, but standing next to the grave of the Soviet soldier in Pyongyang, North Korea. And we can keep doing that. We can reliably keep forging location updates. Even if the watch would send its own, we can override these, and we can have your child bouncing all around the world for as long as we want, basically, while they venture into the forest, right? And then finally, for good measure, another fun thing that we can do is it turns out there is an MQTT message type that will just do a factory reset on the watch. So we can remotely factory reset watches. That doesn't look very interesting on screen because we just send a message here, and then in a second you'll start to see the watch shutting down, and the window will disappear when the watch has fully shut down. Right, so I hope you can all agree with me that this is very bad, because essentially what we have here is just a couple lines of Python away from iterating over all of the emails and doing this for all watches and being able to read the contacts, read the messages, send messages, factory reset the watch, spoof the location. And there's even some more stuff that we really didn't have time to get into. Like the firmware update looks kind of shaky. There's some issues with SMS handling. And, well, as I said earlier, this affects a lot of devices that are being used out there. More than 1.5 million worldwide, every fifth child in Norway. So from my perspective as a security researcher, that's really bad. But apparently you have to be very careful in how you communicate that. Because once again, when I first started talking about this vulnerability, a lot of replies that I got seemed to not understand that this is essentially a buy one, hack 1 million free attack. So some of the comments that I got were like, okay, yeah, so what? You have to send some sort of student to grab the watch from the wrist of my child and then do a 2-hour pin brute force on that? Well, no. We can just buy a single watch. They all have the same static credentials in there. Once we have those, it's over, and then we can just iterate over emails or find emails some other way, and then we can do whatever we want. So I want to be very, very clear about that this time. All right. Now, this gets us to the fun part of the talk, where we desperately try to talk to the vendor and to get them to listen to us and to, well, put politely, fix their shit. And the first step you do, if you want to do that, is you look for some sort of security contact. You look for a vulnerability disclosure program, a bug bounty, something like that. And as a vendor, you would best make sure that this page is very easy to find. In the case of Explorer, I have brought a little quiz for you. These are screenshots from the time of disclosure from their English, Norwegian, and German websites. The question for you is, which of these links lead to Explorer's security vulnerability disclosure program? I'm going to give you a couple seconds. But if you haven't figured it out yet, of course, it is these two. If your Norwegian or your German is a bit rusty, both of these translate essentially to participation. OK, sure. In the end, we did find it. We only found it by trying every single link in the footer, but we did find it. And now we have a page that looks like this. And that seems very promising to us, right? There's a security vulnerability program. There's a bounty. There's some terms and conditions. There's an email we can reach out to. Great. That's everything we need. So we send an email to this address, and we find out that no one will ever reply to you. At least not until you get the press involved. And what we did, alternatively, is we just decided to go via customer support. So we sent a very, very, very long customer support ticket that detailed all of these vulnerabilities and what we were able to do, and basically said, hey, can you give this to whoever is responsible at your company for this kind of stuff? And to their credit, the customer support replied rather quickly. And we got a reply saying that, yes, they forwarded this, their security team is taking immediate action, and an update will be out soon, which sounds great. We checked in a couple months later to ask how it's going, and at that point, we got a reply saying that, well, unfortunately, they can't really engage in a coordinated disclosure process with us, which is a shame because we would have liked to help in making sure this issue is addressed properly. But you know, you do you. We're not going to force you to work with us. And then again, a month later, we realized that our watch actually had a software update available. And so we thought, hey, cool, yeah, fixed. That was quick, amazing. But just to be safe, we should probably have a look at that and see if they actually fixed the issue. And now, at this point, Malte was done with his thesis, so I have the watch lying on my desk. And I'm seeing this update, and I'm thinking, OK, what are the odds that they changed this debug developer pin code? And I really didn't feel like doing all of this brute forcing again. But luckily, since we currently have developer access on this watch, we can also install our own apps. And so I wrote an app. It's a very simple app. It's just mostly these lines of Kotlin. And all that does is it opens this USB debugging screen without asking me for the pin first. And so now I feel safe enough to actually do the update. I do the update, and wouldn't you know it, the old pin that we used doesn't work anymore. Luckily, we have prepared for this scenario, and I can just open up my cool Explorer Unlocker app, and we have debugging access again. Now, we can pull the firmware again, and we can reverse it again a little bit. We already know what we're looking for, and we can, for example, find the function that has changed in regards to the pin code. This is the first time I'm able to show this without big black bars over it. That's fun. So what we see here is that where previously we had only 4 digits in the pin code, we now have six different calls to this string builder.append function. So now we have a 6-digit pin code, which already makes the brute forcing a lot harder for us. And in addition to that, it turns out they also included a timeout mechanism. So after 3 incorrect attempts, we now are locked out for about 60 minutes. So this attack vector, very successfully mitigated. But, well, it turns out, upon closer inspection, that is the only thing that changed in the firmware. They didn't even rotate the static credentials. So all of our proof of concept exploits that I showed you in the videos earlier, those continued to work with 0 modifications. Yeah, not great. And so at that point, we are a bit tired of going through customer support and having this back and forth and this kind of communication that wasn't working out for us. And so we decided to go to the Bundesamt für Sicherheit in der Informationstechnik, the BSI, who also have a vulnerability disclosure program. And well, it turns out that a lot of times having this national organization behind your vulnerability disclosure can make the vendors take you a bit more seriously and helps for them to realize that this is really an issue. So we reported that to them, and in my experience in this case, that was a very good experience for us because then the BSI took over and mediated the communication with Xplora for us and let us know in October that Xplora acknowledged the issue and that they are working on something new and something better, and that they then eventually also said that they fixed the issue. And that kind of corresponded to another firmware update that we saw on our watch. So, you know, we decided to look at that again. And, well, it turns out this time they did rotate the static credentials, but they didn't do anything else. So we update 2 lines in our Python code, we plug in the new static credentials, and everything works again. So we go back to the BSI, and we're like, hey, this is still not fixed, can you talk to them again? And they say, yes, we talked to them, they are working on a new authentication mechanism. But also, at that time, it's been more than half a year that we spent just doing the disclosure without the initial research. And so we decide, hey, maybe it's time to put on some more pressure and also tell them exactly how you could fix this issue. So I included in an email these like 3 steps with minimal changes to your product. Do those and the most severe thing will be fixed. But also, we're going to talk about it publicly. So I submitted a talk at the Chaos Communication Congress late last year, where we first publicly disclosed this vulnerability, and that often also helps get a more rapid response from the vendor once they realize that you're going to do that. And in the lead up to the talk, we were already approached by 2 journalists, one from Der Spiegel and one from a Norwegian state broadcasting company, who were very interested in this attack and then kind of interviewed us and talked to us. And then the reporter from Der Spiegel also reached out to Xplora ahead of the talk to get their side of the story, to get their comment on it. And that's the point where they found our initial email, again, that no one ever replied to. We get to that in a second, because after the talk, we were also quite lucky that we got a lot of press attention on this thing, which really helped, and also is just a very fun experience as a researcher to see that much kind of public, everyday people attention on an issue that we found. So that was very fun. And well, as I said, once the journalists started getting involved, we also heard back from Xplora again. And so 2 days before Christmas, I am in a Zoom call. And I am in a Zoom call with the CTO of Xplora and some of the people from their IoT team who actually write the code for these watches. And that was great. That was a really productive conversation. It is much easier than going over customer support or going over the BSI. So that was very nice. And they explained to me their plan and kind of finally fixing this issue, and also had me provide some more details on how we approached this, and wanted to offer me a job. And I was like, no, I already have a job. It's okay, thank you though. And then they told me that their big plan was to implement something called Opaque. Who of you has heard of Opaque? Wow, academia outreach has to go a lot further, I see. Opaque is this. It's a password-authenticated key exchange protocol. And as you can see from the typesetting and the layout, this is like big boy cryptography, right? This is things that academics think about. And like, yes, it probably would solve their issue. I also think it's massively overkill. for this purpose, I was like, hey, if you want to do that, sure, cool, yeah, do that. But I was also thinking to myself, do I want to see an implementation of a protocol that looks like this from the people who brought us this? Time will tell. Time will tell. And so then I didn't hear anything from Explorer for a while, but I kept checking the watch to see when they would release this firmware update. And in March this year, it was finally the time that my watch showed this nice update notification. And so, of course, I'm going to see what they did. I'm going to see if I can find this mysterious opaque protocol in there. And already at first glance, we can see that this time they really did change stuff. So, for example, the actual pairing UI looks different. Previously, you just had to scan a QR code on the watch with your phone, and that was it. Pairing complete. Now what you have to do is you scan this QR code, and then the phone gives you a 6-digit PIN, and you have to physically enter that PIN on the watch to establish the pairing. So obviously, some thought went into that. And if we pull the firmware again, we also see some changes there. For example, we see the introduction of a new library called Tink. Tink is a crypto library developed by Google that provides implementations of cryptographic primitives in ways that are hard to misuse. So that's great. That's proper crypto being used here. I'm here for it. I like to see that. We also see some references to an ECDSA background key manager class. So that already sounds like we have some asymmetric crypto being involved here. Finally, that's also great. That's also a great step. And most importantly, when we look for the static secrets, they are not there anymore. What we see instead is a dynamic setter function that can be used to set this init key and init secret values dynamically at runtime. And if we see where this function is being used, we will find a reference to a register manager. So presumably this has something to do with the initial registration and pairing process, which all looks very promising. Now, I'll spare you the details of the rest of the reversing afternoon that I poured into this, but what we end up with is a protocol that looks like this. On first setup, the watch is going to send its serial number to the server, and the server is going to reply with a pre-rendered QR code that just encodes a random string. The phone will then scan this QR code and send the ID in it to the server, to which the server replies with the PIN code. And then the PIN code gets entered on the watch. What's interesting here is that I think this entire PIN step that is probably most annoying to users is mostly superfluous, because if the watch actually displays a random identifier and the phone scans that, that should already be enough to establish physical presence. But if you want to add an additional PIN, sure, you can do that. Afterwards, the watch does a bunch of things. The watch generates a random value R, it takes this PIN that it received, and it generates an ECDSA key pair. And it sends this random value, the PIN, and the public key, as well as an encryption of its serial number and a signature over the random value and some other data using this ECDSA key pair. It sends all that to the server, and in reply to that, the server sends this init key and init secret values. And then for the rest of the lifetime of the watch, the authentication works in exactly the same way that we've seen before. So the same requests, but this time we actually have unique credentials for every single watch, which mitigates successfully the issue that brought all of these vulnerabilities about. Now, I want to highlight the encryption function that they're using here, because they actually added that in this firmware version. Oh, OK, I forgot about this slide. This looks very similar to what I wrote in the email to them. This looks very similar to these 3 points with some extra steps added in between for no apparent purpose. But it's very cool to see that they took that to heart and kind of implemented that. And apparently, it also worked for them in addressing the vulnerability. Now, the encryption function that we use to encrypt the serial number looks like this. And hands down, that's the best cryptographic code I've seen from Explorer this far. I want to highlight some very nice things. It actually hashes the key before using it, so we use a uniform value and not some random password. And we generate a new initialization vector every single time. Great, amazing. And we also use authenticated encryption, AES in GCM mode. That's pretty cool. There is still a fun vulnerability on this slide. If you spot it, feel free to talk to me later. But yeah, with that, we have this entire protocol that uses this encryption function. And now, an interesting thing to consider is, what do all of these steps of cryptography actually do? Because it turns out for a lot of them, the answer is not so much. What we do here is we generate this random value, and then we use the random value to encrypt the serial number, but we send the random value alongside in the same request. So an attacker can just take the random value, decrypt the serial number, change the serial number, re-encrypt the serial number, because we sent the key alongside the encrypted string. And the same thing kind of applies to this ECDSA signature. We send the pub key for the first time to the server and include a signature that does prove that we control the corresponding private key. But again, an attacker could just swap that out with their own key material. And even beyond that, from what I can tell, this key pair is never, ever used again. So in the end, what this looks like to me is something like this. We could just send the data, or we could choose a random value from a specific alphabet. We could compute a hash over it, then choose a random IV, then do authenticated encryption on that using AES GCM, then generate an expensive elliptic key pair, then compute a signature over that, then pack all of that together and then send that. And there's no added security properties from any of these fancy new cryptographic primitives that they tried to slap in there. So yeah, I think I don't want to see their implementation of opaque. I'm glad they went with something different, and they flung spaghetti at the wall long enough that something stuck, and they mitigated the core issue, which is good, I guess. So that's how the journey kind of ended for me. But as one more little gimmick for you, because this is Troopers, and I like to have one little thing at the end, I can now also publish this cool little unlocker gadget that I made, where you just enter your email, and it gives you a PIN code to unlock your watch. So if any one of you has an Explorer X6 Play Gen 1 and wants to experiment with uploading your own Android apps on there, now you can. The link is on the slides, and there's also a Git repo that I'm going to make public in just a few minutes that has this unlocking app that you can also use as a template to build your own apps for the Explorer Watch. But that's it from me for today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions?
Somewhere close to the beginning of your talk,
Yeah.
there was the attack where you managed to basically show a push notification on the watch, and
Yeah.
You sent a message, and then you sent to the parents, and then you sent an MQTT message to the watch, right? And I see that this message, strictly speaking, doesn't contain anything the watch shouldn't be able to know, but it's also a message the watch sent, and it's not intended for the watch.
Yeah.
So, and the watch was still able to get it from the REST API.
Yes.
But there was no other like access control issue there, so you couldn't use the API to access messages that weren't.
To be completely honest, I didn't try if we can access messages from a different account, but to me it looked a lot like the IDs that we get are rather short. So I think these are unique to your account and the conversations on your watch. I suppose that's secure. And we did some testing earlier with like cross-account data access using these APIs, and there we didn't end up finding anything.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any more questions? Back there.
Yeah, so first of all, wonderful talk, super insightful. So I was wondering about the research setup behind, specifically like Android. Did you use something like Android Studio for like simulating, you know, an Android installation, or like a virtual machine when you were testing, or did you all just do it with the hardware directly?
Thank you. Good question. We did using an Android emulator for some of this, but mostly for development of this unlocking app, for example, because then it's a fast way to test stuff. All of the other stuff we actually did with the actual watch itself, because the apps that are running on there are, well, they are delivered in this optimized format, so we don't have the APKs just lying around that we could transfer to another device. And because this is an OEM setup where they built this entire system for the watch, all of these components are highly interconnected. So I think it's not really feasible to just pull one of the apps and run it on an emulator, but it's really best to observe this whole system as a whole. And with ADB access, there's not much of a difference anyway, because we have all the access and the nice development tools that we could like, even without using an emulator or virtual device.
Right. And did you also use the ADP access to get the APKs to like reverse engineer the firmware?
Yeah, exactly. The ADB access that we get is not root level. So there's some things that we can't get, some low-level firmware and stuff. But it was enough to be able to pull a copy of all of the vendor-defined apps and be able to analyze those. Yeah.
Okay. And one last question regarding the cryptography. So I saw this kind of weird, you know, shenanigans at the end of the talk. Would that have been solved by using like a secure key exchange like Diffie-Hellman or something?
You're talking about the last protocol I showed?
Yes.
Well, I think my hot take is you wouldn't need anything. You could just send the plaintext data. You already have TLS protecting the connection. And for this first-time setup, it's really enough to have the phone prove that it knows the identifier of the watch. And then ideally, you could think about a key exchange of some sort where the watch just shares its public key in the QR code or something, and then you immediately have strong cryptographic trust between them. But I think all of these fancy primitives that they use there were, in the end, useless, and I don't know if I would even replace them with other proper fancy crypto, when really just sending the plain text over TLS in this case would be quite sufficient, in my opinion.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question. For a lot of China-based OEMs, they have like label brands. Like it's not necessary like they can use the same firmware for a lot of different brands. Did you check if this firmware runs on non-Explorer device? Like a lot of them just put their labels, and there is another manufacturer at the end that the spread its firmware all around these devices.
Yeah, that's a good question. That actually was the case for earlier Explorer models, where I mentioned this TROOPERS26 company, because there we know that they were just using white label hardware, and you could get the same hardware in China domestically from Chiho directly under their own brand, running their own software. So in that case, that was the case. For these watches, we don't really know, because we don't know who the vendor is. I haven't seen any other listings for watches that look highly similar in terms of hardware. And from the firmware side, this one is just running Android. So could you run the same firmware somewhere else? Yes. You could probably run this on a rooted Android phone if you spent enough time. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions?
it's hopefully a short one. Which Android version is running, and do you know if it's using the general kernel image?
Yes, we checked that. It's a very old kernel. So I know there were some recent Android privilege escalation things that were rather big. Those would probably work. And the Android version itself, I don't know off the top of my head, but it's also a quite old API level. Yeah, but I would guess if I would say a version now, a specific one.
Okay, I was afraid.
Yeah, but the kernel definitely is like kind of, I don't know, like 5-6 years old or something, at least.
I also have one short question.
Also one more there.
Yeah. The thing where you unlock the developer settings is now also in the wild. Isn't that a vulnerability in itself? And did you report that? Because now children can basically hack their watch and pretend to be somewhere else.
I think if the children want to hack their own watches, I support that. Thank you. So when I gave a version of this talk in late last year in December, we deliberately did not publish this code generation capability because at that time there wasn't a fix out. So at that time, anyone who had a watch could use that pin to get access to all of the watches. Now it's been, what, like 4 months or something since the patch has been out. And now if you do this to your watch with physical access, you go through all the trouble, you enter the pin, you can only play with your own watch. And I think being able to play with our own hardware is most of the time a good thing. I wouldn't want to take that away from children.
Yeah, thank you for a great talk. It was really interesting. Are you aware of any activities to install a custom firmware on this watch? Like if it's Android and Linux, it's open source, we should be able to get the source from the vendor, at least for the kernel.
I mean, I'm not aware of anyone currently actively working on that. I talked to some people who, just like you, said, hey, that would be cool, it sounds possible. I think it is possible, especially if you use some sort of privilege escalation to get root access to the watch, then you can do whatever you want. You can already install your own Android apps. For the last talk, I did a little gimmick where I installed a version of Signal on the watch. I don't recommend that to anyone. The screen is tiny, the processor is very bad, but technically you can pull it off. But at that point, I'm not sure if it's worth going through all of the effort when you could also just buy a cheap white label Android smartwatch that doesn't have these limitations and this custom firmware on it from the start.
Thanks.